Hello and good morning. Welcome to Monday. At least we're pretty sure it's Monday, June 29th, 2020, as in the year that shall never end. But we are almost halfway through it. This is CosmoQuest. This is Community Coffee, and I am your host, Gillian Rhodes. It is Monday, which means it is time for space art. Every Monday you can join me to, and I will use this joke again, and many times in the future, to steam ahead into the week with a few discussions on astronomy and art and all of the wonderful ways that they fuse and fission into some pretty amazing things. Today, I do actually have a guest after a few weeks of you just listening to me blather at the camera. And I'm very excited about it. You have kind of met this person indirectly, as a couple of weeks ago I did the astronomy poetry show, and the first one of the poems that I read, which was about the TRAPPIST system, it was this wonderful poem about the TRAPPIST system, was written by an American astrophysicist, Sean Raymond, who is currently living in Bordeaux, France. And I decided that his website and his poetry was awesome enough that he needed to come and be a guest on the show. And so he's joining me today from France. How are you, Sean? Thank you for being here.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Great. So just go ahead and give us an introduction on you and a little bit in your work.
So I'm an astronomer. So for my research, my research focuses on planets. And so one big aspect of that is how the solar system formed. Another one is planets around other stars, how to find them, how to understand how they formed and how their orbits change in time. Things like asteroids and comets and interstellar objects. These are the kind of things I study, day to day for my normal job. And then I also have a blog called planetplanet.net where I do various kind of mingling of science and imagination, including some poems like the one you're talking
about. Awesome. Yeah, the planetary system, I mean, good luck with that, right? Like, it's such, I just feel like these days, every day there's something new that kind of comes out, and there's a Momoa and all of that, crazy interstellar travelers that come blasting through. So that's pretty cool research.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a very active time right now. There's so many things going on. Every couple of weeks, there's some groundbreaking new discovery. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, cool. And so when did you start to, mix astronomy and art, writing poetry, you do world building and this kind of stuff. So was that kind of always in parallel, or was there a time when you kind of brought one or the other in?
It really happened, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. As a kid, I wanted to be a writer for a while. And then obviously that didn't happen. I ended up doing science and stuff. But at some point I was like, I've done lots of research. It would be great to write a book. And I didn't want to write a book that was just kind of recapping what we know about something. I wanted to write a book that was sort of a little bit kind of exploring what we think we know in a sort of imaginative way. And so I wanted to write this book about how planets get destroyed. And that was my plan. And so I contacted someone I know who writes books, the scientist Caleb Scharf, who writes really good books for the general public about science. And he suggested, he's like, you got to practice writing. So the best way to do that is start a blog and just write stuff. And so I did that. So I started a blog, Planet, 6 or 7 years ago. And I just started kind of writing about stuff. And so I was trying not to just do recaps of research. So sometimes I just do recaps where I wrote a paper that I think is interesting enough that the general public would want to know. And so I write about that. But sometimes it's more like a general question, like a bigger question, like what do we think about this various, this topic? Where did Earth's water come from? Why do we care about that? The kind of big picture things. And then I started to go into more imaginative things like, well, if we care about life in the universe, could other systems do better than ours? And what would it look like? And I was trying to go like imaginative, but still constrained by, by reality to some degree. Like, so I kind of got into it that way.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll talk about those, the engineered solar systems in a little bit. But because I was reading your poetry on the show a couple weeks ago, how do they're very sort of Dr. Seuss, very lighthearted. And so what's your process for writing them? Do you try and like go for the rhymes more, the rhythm, or like, trying to fit in as many facts as you can? So how does that work?
What I usually do is I kind of list out the actual points I want to make. If I want to communicate some amount of things, usually the number of things I want to communicate is pretty small. And then, then what I usually do is I do kind of like you suspect. I actually keep some Dr. Seuss books in my office, and I read them. I read one or two books before I start writing, because when I do it without kind of priming myself in that way, I run into roadblocks like immediately. But when I'm used to kind of the flow of these things, it helps. I also listen to things like Hamilton beforehand, and I love Hamilton.
Love that soundtrack. Love it, love it, love it.
So just listening to that kind of gets in the flow of like talking in that way where there's lots of content in a rhyming way also. Oh, did I disappear? Oh no.
Everybody out there, sorry, Gillian has dropped, but please, Sean, this is Tim, your producer. Please, Sean, continue.
I'll just keep talking then. Okay. So I'll go ahead and talk more about the stuff I've been doing. So I really enjoy doing the kind of outreachy stuff, the writing the poems. It's a fun way of communicating that's different. At the beginning, I've done outreach kind of things where you have a paper, a scientific paper. We discovered this thing. And then we try to, communicate that thing to the general public by writing an article that's a little bit easier to understand. And I find that in poem form, it kind of captivates people in a different way. And I really got into it because I had kids and was reading Dr. Seuss books like 5 times a day. So.
Right. So basically, my power has gone out again. So I'm just here on the balcony. You can see me slightly.
Oh.
And possibly internet down. All right, we'll get Gillian back here at some point.
All right.
Please, Sean.
Should I just keep rambling? I can ramble for a while if you like.
Oh, go for it. Maybe a reading. Oh, there she is.
There she is.
Sort of.
Can you hear us now, Gillian?
I can hear you. Yes. Power problem. We can do a reading, but I can ask you questions right now. If it's the data, I'm on my data, so hopefully it can go through a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, welcome to CosmoQuest with Gillian, which means there are technical issues. It's just a thing that happens. Sean, I would like you to talk a little bit about your book. And I think it's Earth and Mars, Black Hole and Stars.
Yeah, sure. So the title right now is Black Hole, Stars, Earth and Mars. And it's basically what happened with that is book about them. And I was like, oh, okay. And so origin story, but that's where it came from. So then I kind of planned out some poems to write, and wrote poems about all different aspects of astronomy, from telescopes and what constellations you can see, to galaxies, to the solar system and exoplanets, and the search for life in the universe. And so I wrote a whole bunch of poems about this, all in the same general kind of Dr. Seuss style. Then there were some things that kind of needed illustrations. And my son, Owen, who's 12 years old, he draws pretty well. And so I asked him to do some drawings for me, some kind of simple sketches to get some key points across that are a little harder to transmit with words. And so he did those drawings for me.
Right.
And we stuck it together as a book. And so I asked a few publishers about it, and they were not interested at all. They
Oh
kept telling me
no.
it didn't fit in any of their categories. It was kind of between categories, and so they didn't know what to do with it. And so, given that you can
Right.
publish on Amazon, that's what we're going to do. So the plan is to
Yeah.
self-publish in
That's
the coming weeks or months. I'm not sure.
right. Well, the interesting thing about Amazon, and which I've actually self-published, so I know this, is that you can, if you format it correctly, you can set it up so that they print on demand, so you can actually get paperback, like a proper book in your hand, which is really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
That's what we're going to try to do. Is the thing where you can print it yourself.
yeah, and so you sent me this book and I read it, and it was really interesting. But like we were talking before the show, in some ways, when I heard about the book, I thought it was just kind of a collection of poems about space. But what it is actually very educational. Like I feel like it's, you should give it to, your sixth grade science classroom, to astronomy 101, and to to basically communicate some of these basic ideas about astronomy. It's just so comprehensive. Was that planned, or was it just kind of like throw everything you can, or was it about the rhymes, or how did you kind of plan the content?
I mean, I think I really did come up at it sort of from like an astronomy 101 perspective. Like if I was going to write this astronomy book, then kind of the hook to get people interested and hopefully keep them interested as long as possible is the rhyming and throwing a few silly things in there, and
Right,
then the content is just kind of like what we think we know about space. And so there's lots of
right,
things in there where I'm pretty upfront about we think this, but we're not 100% sure. We used to think this
yeah,
other idea, but now it turns out we were wrong about that one. And so trying to
yep,
like be upfront about we don't know everything. What do we know, and just kind of interesting stuff about space. But
yeah,
it is a lot of information. That's true. So.
yeah. Yeah. So, kind of moving on a different topic, one of the other things that you do on your blog, and you kind of talk about in your about, is basically world building for science fiction, right? And so, can you talk a little bit about that? Do you work with authors, or as kind of as a consultant, or do you world build your own sort of universes? How does that work?
So I kind of stumbled upon this totally by accident. What happened is when I started this blog, the idea was I'm going to practice writing, for a general audience. And I thought, oh, I can ask whatever questions I want. And so one of the first blog posts I did was redesigning the solar system. So it was saying, what if you were constrained to keep all the orbits within the solar system and all the solar system planets and moons, but you could move them around? Could you, in principle, you can't do it in real life, but can you, in theory, make a solar system that had more than one potentially habitable planet? And so I started with that
Right.
one. And just moving things around, I came up with a system that was, plausibly could have, I think, 7 habitable worlds. The key thing was moving Jupiter onto Mars's orbit and having a bunch of moons around Jupiter that might have life on them. And I noticed that
Right, right.
that became by far my most viewed blog post. And so I thought, well,
Okay.
if I was going to do this in a more general sense, which I didn't even know world building was a thing at the time. Then
Right.
if I don't have to stick to the solar system, I can kind of expand things. But I
Right.
still have to be constrained to some degree by what planets really should exist and what orbits are stable. Then how would I do that in a bigger scale? And then I started building these bigger systems that have 20, 30, hundreds of planets in the habitable zone. And it got kind of out of control, but it's all stable. I remember at some point I ran n-body simulations to really verify that these things really were stable. And
I've seen one of them. I don't know what the link is offhand, but there's one where you have I don't know, 156 planets that are some of them are going one way and some of them are going the other way, and there's 8 per orbit or something like that. It was pretty mad.
yeah, it's nuts. I mean, I ended up going through some old papers on celestial mechanics and rediscovering. So I didn't necessarily do the research and discover this was a real thing, but I kind of found it and applied it to this new, this realm of world building. The idea being that you think of the Earth going around the sun, and you can
Hmm.
imagine, well, if you wanted to have another Earth, how close could its orbit be? And there's some critical distance. If a second Earth was too close to Earth, then it wouldn't be stable because the gravity between the two Earths would mess them up.
Right.
But it turns out that a ring of planets, all sharing the same orbit, as long as they're spaced enough along the ring, can be stable. And so this is this crazy idea that was figured out actually in the 80s and then rediscovered in 2010, and then I kind of grabbed that. And so based on that, you could have a ring of 42 Earths orbiting the sun on the same orbit. And so in principle, you could have,
crazy.
you know, that, and then you can build on that and have other rings of planets. It's really nuts, but it's dynamically stable for it.
That's amazing. There was a question from the chat that came through. Somebody was asking if you've used a universal sandbox.
I have used it, yeah, myself a little bit. And they imported this system that we're talking about, which I called the ultimate engineered solar system. I called it that because there are some systems that had a lot of planets in the habitable zone. And you can say, if everything goes right 10 times in a row, then maybe you could, a real system could form that would have many, many planets in the habitable zone. But these ones are so exotic that you would never expect it to happen in nature. So I call it the engineered, you know, the ultimate engineered solar system. And in Universe Sandbox, some engineers who work there have imported it into there. And so if you go into certain menus, you can find it, and they've modeled it, and it looks really cool. You can see, you can fly through it and stuff and see how the orbits change and stuff. It's neat.
Okay. And one more question from the chat, and then I have a question about this world building, is how long are these things stable? Like, do they just kind of keep on going, or is there only a window in which they're stable for?
Oh yeah, I mean, so it depends how you build them. In everything that I've done, I've kind of wanted it to be stable for billions of years. So at least say as long as Earth has been stable around the sun.
Okay.
So they're all stable for our kind of typical human timeframes. They're stable. They'll be stable for at least billions of years.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty amazing. Okay, so I want to talk about, kind of science fiction. We think about science fiction as out of this world, it's kind of envisioning the future. There's a lot of, I guess, artistic license that people take with physics when it comes to science fiction, in terms of interstellar travel and all this kind of stuff. So kind of where do you fall on that spectrum? Like, do you think that, would you prefer that a science fiction be more accurate, or that, there's some basically, like I said, artistic license in physics that science fiction writers can take?
So personally, I am very good at suspending my disbelief. So I often go to movies with friends who are also scientists, and I'll love a movie and they'll be all upset because something wasn't accurate. So personally, I don't mind at all when there's lots of freedom like that. What I think is kind of interesting is that based on, real science stuff, it's possible to build worlds or imagine scenarios that are really exotic without having to go towards something that's impossible, or that we think right now is impossible.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of space for creativity within the realm of what we think is possible, rather than having to jump right away to things that are probably not.
Yeah, it's like, as they say, truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like there's a lot of missing exploration within that truth realm, where you can find things that are really odd, that are stable, that are plausible. Like, for example, there's real ones that are found all the time. For example, the TRAPPIST-1 planetary system that was found a few years ago now. Like that one, I mean, it's not like anyone could have predicted that. It's a really exotic thing, kind of in between Jupiter's Galilean moons and the solar system, where it's a super squished down version of a planetary system with 3 planets that might be in the habitable zone. And so it's really exotic and not really what people were expecting, but why not? It exists.
Yeah. So we've got another question from the chat, which is Michael Myers asking, have you constructed worlds for any novels that we could read?
So I have had maybe 5 or 10 science fiction writers contact me to ask if they could use these kind of worlds or these planetary systems that I've put out there on my blog in books. And I'm not aware of any that are already out. I'm aware of a couple that are kind of in progress. And so my philosophy is always that anything that I put out there is up for grabs. So I'm happy to give away. I've had several people contact me and say, I'm writing a book. I want to have this type of system. Is it realistic? What would I need to change for this phenomenon to be important? And I sometimes go back and forth with different people on those kind of questions to try to make it both, because there is a place within the realm of reality where that could exist without having to appeal to something that's impossible. So nothing right now, but yes.
So I've just, it makes me think of, it's not exactly artsy, but or maybe it is, I guess, like what's the most elegant system that you can think of, the like the most, if the solar system had an artist design it, like what would that look like?
I think the prettiest thing would be a really simple twist on the solar system, which is to have a co-orbital planet with Earth. So I talked about these rings of planets that are very exotic, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a real phenomenon that we find often in simulations of how planets form, and is actually present in the Saturn system. Is are planets that share the same orbit. And so there's different ways that this can happen. Jupiter has a bunch of co-orbital asteroids called the Trojans and Greek asteroids that orbit more or less 60 degrees in front of it and behind it. And there's a whole other exotic class of orbits that are called horseshoe orbits, where Janus and Epimetheus in Saturn's rings are actually in this configuration where they basically share the same orbit, but they actually drift apart, and then every so often, every few years, if I remember it, they come close together and they have a little exchange, and they go back around, and then you have a little exchange like that. I find it really pretty. It's a nice idea. So if I was in charge, I would have a horseshoe co-orbital to the Earth.
Interesting. Hexacosticoron, I think that's how you say the whole name, but I would just say Hex. Do you go into space fleet designs or alien cultures with your world building, or is it primarily the planetary systems themselves?
I've only gone in the planetary systems part, really. When I've done a series of, sometimes I do posts where I kind of come up with some new idea where I think, imagine this concept might be important. And I write like little mini stories to go along with it, imagining some kind of culture and how that would affect things. But they're usually like a page long. So no, I've never gone into the guts of that. I think it's a really interesting thing, but I personally haven't gone there.
Okay, cool. So what's next? Like, what are you working on these days? Obviously you have this book that you're working on. What's coming up in the next few days, and where can people go to kind of find more about your work and your research and your creative work?
So to find out more, just on planetplanet.net, there's links and stuff. In terms of what's next, I mean, what I struggle to find is time to do a lot of the more creative stuff, because I have my day job is doing the more technical research part. And so I struggled with the question of why am I doing this research for many years, and I still do often. And I justify it to myself that I don't mind that public money is going to fund my research that's pretty technical, as long as I give something back. And so what I try to give back is the public outreach kind of thing, of communicating things, of throwing out interesting ideas that hopefully will captivate some people. And so I try to do that regularly to some degree, but I haven't had time to put a lot of time into that. And so the book, most of the poem book I wrote kind of on the side here and there, and the same for most of the blog. And so my plans for the future are to kind of keep it going and try to keep things going. And so I live a lot on feedback from people. If people tell me, if several people tell me they really like the poems, then maybe I'll try to do more poems, or they like a different aspect of that kind of creative stuff, then I would focus on that.
Definitely. So all you guys, go check out Sean's website and take a look around, and let him know what you think. It's very cool. I just was peeking through it, and just some of the systems that you're engineering are just fascinating. They're very cool. It just the sort of, again, it's like truth is stranger than fiction. Like you would not think these things are stable.
No, it's really crazy. With just gravity, there's all these really unexpected configurations that can come up. And sometimes, well, one fun thing that I know people like, because I have a bunch of people who have told me to do this one more, is to take specific systems from science fiction stories and go a little deeper and say, could that really happen? If it could, then what conditions do you really need? Because like we talked about, oftentimes they're kind of thrown in as a setting for a story without really being vetted carefully. And so some things that are interesting, like one really interesting case is like Nightfall, which is a story by Isaac Asimov, where there's this planet that's in date. It's basically, it hasn't had a nighttime in, oh, I forget, I knew these numbers a while ago, like 2,000 years. And then there's all nightfall. And so how could that really happen in nature? And so I spent a long time showing that the setup they have in the book doesn't work and how to make it. And so that kind of thing is fun. And it's also a direct connection between science fiction and science, which I think have a nice link already.
So can you have a planet that has like 2,000 years a day and then suddenly becomes night? Is that a thing that you can engineer?
Yeah, it's doable. You need to have a really weird setup, though. It's not something that would happen just by accident, but it's not impossible. I went into detail on this. I wrote some long blog posts about this a couple of years ago, but it's possible. And I don't even remember the answer of exactly how it was set up because I got all deep into it and then I forgot it. Oh, you still there?
That's very cool. Sort of. I'm sort of still here. Well, Sean, thank you so much for talking with me and for putting up this. I have basically, as soon as I start live streaming, there's a technical problem. I think I'm cursed. I don't know how it works, but thank you for being here, and it's just been really fascinating to talk to you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on there. Thanks for actually reading the poem book and giving me feedback. I appreciate that.